各位现场以及线上的贵宾、媒体朋友们，大家早安 ！Greetings to all of you on site or online and friends from the press. Good morning， 非常欢迎参加消除一切形式种族歧视国际公约首次国家报告国际审查会议结论性意见与建议发表记者会。Welcome to the press conference.And presentation, the concluding observations of the review meeting of the initial R.O.C's report under the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. 那国际审查委员会呢，在过去几天已经和台湾政府机关以及非政府组织呢，有非常充分的交流以及交换意见呢，相信能够协助台湾呢进一步的落实 ICERD， 同时推动人权进展。The International Review Committee has had a lot of discussion and exchanged ideas with the Taiwan government delegation and civil society groups and has come to the concluding observations that they are going to share with us later during the press conference. And we believe and we are going to incorporate all of them into our efforts in further implementing ICERD and pushing human rights forward here in Taiwan. 那接下来呢，为大家介绍我们今天记者会现场的贵宾。首先呢是台上的贵宾，让我们掌声欢迎行政院罗秉成政务委员。Let me introduce to you to your distinguished guest. We have Minister without Portfolio Executive Yuan 罗秉成，以及我们台上的4位国际审查委员 and members of the International Review Committee. We have Professor Manfred Novak, Chairman of the International Review Committee. 我们委员会的主席，欢迎 Ms. Rosalind Runan 委员，欢迎 Professor Cheryl Lightfoot 委员。And Professor Keiko Ko 以及 Keiko Ko 委员，欢迎。接下来呢，为大家介绍的是政府机关代表团的副团长、内政部吴荣辉次长 Deputy Head of Government Delegation, Deputy Minister of the Interior 吴荣辉。接下来呢，为大家介绍是我们国家人权委员会的委员们。Next, the Commissioners of National Human Rights Commission. 首先是洪义章委员 Commissioner Ubai Radik Kanasab. 王佑霖委员 Commissioner 王佑霖。纪惠荣委员 Commissioner 纪惠荣。以及内政部移民署钟景坤署长，让我们掌声欢迎。And 钟景坤 Director General of National Immigration Agency, Ministry of the Interior. Welcome.欢迎。那接下来呢，我们记者会一开始，首先就有请行政院罗秉成政务委员为我们开场。And now to open the press conference, let's welcome Minister without Portfolio Executive Yuan 罗秉成，有请政委。
好，谢谢。
Thank you. Professor Novak, the chair of the R.O.C, and Ms. Noonan, Ms. Ko, and Ms. Lightfoot, and Deputy Minister Wu, and the commissioners from NHRC, the head of NIA, dear heads of all government agencies, dear friends from the NGOs, good morning. We've been waiting for this report for how long? For half of a century. Well, to be specific, we've been waiting for 53 years. In promoting human rights development, as stated in the concluding observations and recommendations by Professor Novak, who helped review the developments in the past 15 years, that is to say, from the two covenants which have been domesticated through the Implementation Act. Taiwan has produced its initial report under the two covenants. And this report is the 12th state reports. There are 4 for CEDAW. There are 3 for the two covenants. And there are 2 for CRC and CRPD. And this is the first one for ICERD. However, this was the first convention that was ratified. That was 53 years ago in 1971. The ICERD Convention had become domestic law for our country. But as the experts pointed out, for decades, this convention was not being implemented. So it was first born, but it is implemented the latest until decades after, we're seeing the first reports under the ICERD. If we look beyond 15 years ago, I think it was in 2004 when President Chen was in the office. He created the Presidential Office Human Rights Consultative Committee. And the group ended its mandate in 2020 or 2022. I think many of the NGO representatives here used to be the committee members. So during President Chen's time, I thought that was a period for incubation. I think when we develop human rights, we need a top-down approach instead of a bottom-up, relying only on the NGOs. I think the government need to promote the implementation of human rights protections. And then by the time of President Ma, that was a period of the new beginning, because that was when conventions were domesticated, state reports were published, and during the 8-year term, many reports were published, and a good foundation was laid down. And President Tsai, she's approaching the end of 8 years of her term. I would say that this period is an acceleration period. The Department of Human Rights and the periodic state reports mostly occur in President Tsai's term. So I think we're seeing the baton being passed down from one president to the next, with the expectations of with the government and the NGOs, and with the joint efforts from the NGOs. Everything together made us where we are right now. So I would like to thank Chair Professor Novak for leading this panel. I think there has been a very hardworking week. I heard from my colleagues that the R.O.C had 2 days of review meeting, and they originally expected to provide the concluding observations by 8 p.m. on Wednesday, but they worked till 2 a.m. And then they wake up at 5 a.m. again to revise the concluding observations and recommendations. So a round of applause for the experts. Thank you so much for your efforts. And we see that you take the state report very seriously, and you have so many exchanges with the government delegates and NGO delegates. I was in one of the sessions. The 4 committee members all raised many questions. And we are seeing 48 recommendations in the concluding observations and recommendations. I think they all point out what we can do more for ICERD. Some of the recommendations are very inspiring. I think they will serve as a good foundation for the government and the NGOs to have more dialogues in order to push the policies forward to one day reach the goals of ICERD, so that we can have a day without any racial discrimination or any forms of discrimination. During this period of time, Deputy Minister Wu from MOI and Minister Zhong from NIA and all the teams also spent great efforts. I think this is the first time for the organizer to do this. A round of applause for them. I also want to thank many friends from NGOs. During the review, you came to the NGO session to raise your recommendations, and many of you are also here today at the press conference. You continue to keep your eye on us, watch us. We understand you have expectations. We also understand that you have ideals for human rights, and that's the responsibility on our shoulders. when we promote human rights, it is necessary to have NGOs to supervise us, to encourage us. Without NGOs, we will not be able to move forward. You are a very important driver or the wheels to push human rights forward. Without your support, criticism, we wouldn't be able to do this. So a round of applause for all of the NGOs. The IRC members are here on site to review the implementation. I think Professor Novak and Ms. Noonan have come to Taiwan for multiple times. Taiwan is a mature democracy, so government delegates and NGO representatives may show their diverse opinions, and even among NGOs, there are different opinions. But this is a demonstration of the fact that we're not afraid to express our opinions. You're always free to express what you think. For me, this is the most valuable part in our democracy. We need to protect it. So the resilience of democracy has to be built upon human rights. Without human rights, democratic resilience cannot be built. I believe this is what we all welcome, to leverage this kind of mechanism. We self-commit ourselves to international conventions and invite international IRC members to come to Taiwan to conduct a local review. This mechanism is something that we can share with the world, even though Taiwan is not recognized by the United Nations. Yet Taiwan plays an active role in promoting human rights, in sharing our human rights experiences and practices with the world. With this opportunity, we're able to invite international experts to be in Taiwan to give their recommendations. This is a wonderful gift we get. I think the wonderful gift is the concluding observations and recommendations. Now I will give the floor to the 4 experts so that they can talk to us about the recommendations.
To the International Review Committee members, firstly, Professor Novak. 接下来把时间交给主席。
Yeah, Minister Low, distinguished representatives of various governmental agencies, the National Human Rights Commission, I think the international community that is here, to civil society organizations, and all the others who are following here in person or online this final press conference, which is a presentation of our concluding observations and recommendations as the International Review Committee. I will give a short introduction and then we open the floor for any kind of questions and comments by you that will then be answered by my colleagues or myself. As you have said already, we had many people who were assisting us, and I am particularly grateful to the government having taken care so well of us, but also would like to mention those who were staying with us also late in the night when we were actually drafting and finally adopting these concluding observations. It was whether it was Lingus, Ellen, Serena, but also Alvin who helped us, and last but not least Imke Steinmann, who is sitting here. Who was, without her we would have been sitting until 6 in the morning to finalize that. I guess you have the text of the concluding observations and recommendations, so I'm not going through in detail, only highlight a few issues. And we started with positive aspects, and I really want to underline that already last year we received, and Keiko has it with here, so very, very comprehensive, the initial report, the core common document, but also then the replies, very detailed replies to our list of issues. The National Human Rights Commission provided us with a comprehensive report, and again, parallel responses. And we didn't bring them because they would be that high. So many comments by various non-governmental organizations. So we were really provided with a lot of information. I'm also very grateful for the very active and well-informed professional participation of all the relevant governmental agencies, the National Human Rights Commission, civil society organization, and for the open and transparent process of the hearings, including interpretation into Chinese, English, and sign language, and the live webcast. On the legal status of the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, we heard that although it has legal status with the same effect as domestic law, it is regarded by the government and courts of Taiwan as containing no directly applicable provisions. And this different from the other treaties which were domesticated, the two covenants, the Convention Against Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which were all incorporated into domestic law by specific enforcement or implementation acts. Such an act has not yet been adopted by the Convention on Racial Discrimination, which might have to do with the fact that it had been ratified already at a time when Taiwan still was representing China in the United Nations. So that's why the government, or the committee recommends that the government transform the Racial Discrimination Convention into domestic law in the same way as it did with respect to other core UN human rights treaties. It should therefore adopt as soon as possible a specific implementation or enforcement act with the aim of domesticating this convention in Taiwanese law. But at the same time, we also recommend that the government submit this draft bill of the Equality and Anti-Discrimination Act, where we got the first draft during our deliberations. It should submit that as quickly as possible to a comprehensive review by the National Human Rights Commission, civil society organizations, and most importantly, directly affected communities, such as indigenous peoples, migrant workers, persons with disabilities, the LGBTI community, and others, for an adoption as speedy as possible by the legislative yuan. Regarding Article 4, there are reports that hate speech, particularly against indigenous peoples and certain ethnic groups, have not been mitigated, and that hate speech in cyberspace has significantly increased. And in that respect, we take note of Article 4A of the Convention, which requires criminal sanctioning of hate speech, but in the meantime ensure that all other measures are taken to eliminate hate speech and hate crimes in practice. With respect to Article 6, the remedies, the committee recommends that the government make efforts to ensure that all channels of remedies are more accessible to the victims of racial discrimination. Then we devoted a very comprehensive chapter to the rights of indigenous peoples in Taiwan, where again, which is also to much extent based on the United Nations Declaration on the Right of indigenous peoples. In that respect, the committee recommends, and there are many recommendations, I'm not citing all, that the government include, and that is very important, include representatives of indigenous peoples in engagements between the government and indigenous peoples, selected through their own representative institutions and advocacy groups, to take concrete steps in consultation and cooperation with indigenous peoples to incorporate an implementation framework for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples into domestic law, co-design with indigenous peoples an independent mechanism to review and monitor compliance with the many provisions of the Declaration, review and reform the structure and practices of the Council of Indigenous Peoples, CIP, in consultation and cooperation with indigenous peoples to ensure its alignment with the Declaration. On self-determination, we recommend that the government review and reform the Indigenous Peoples' Basic Law and its enforcement mechanisms, to review and amend the current regulations on consultation to comply with the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, and to undertake a full review of identification regulations for indigenous peoples. On land issues, the committee recommends that the government hold dialogues with indigenous and non-indigenous peoples to identify laws and policies that can be created or amended to enable indigenous peoples' land rights that align with international human rights standards. On the disposal of nuclear waste, which was very much to the concern of the review committee on the two covenants, the committee recommends that the government take urgent measures to find a lasting solution to the disposal of nuclear waste in alignment with Article 29.2 of the UN Declaration. On indigenous languages, the committee recommends that the government engage in a dialogue with indigenous peoples in order to identify remaining issues in the household registration system that may discriminate against indigenous peoples and their languages, especially in identification practices. With respect to health, the committee recommends that the government collate data related to the health care of indigenous peoples and design a system that allows representatives of indigenous peoples and health advocacy groups to participate in the assessment of health indicators and the design of the healthcare service model. And finally, on hunting and fishing, the committee recommends that the government review, in consultation and cooperation with indigenous peoples, the existing hunting control-related laws and regulations. Another comprehensive chapter refers to the rights of migrant workers, where the committee recommends that the government review comprehensively the Employment Service Act to identify and remove discriminatory restrictions on migrant workers, including the right to change employers, accommodation provisions, access to health services, the right to organize and join trade unions, and survivors' benefits, to include as a matter of urgency a provision of law for migrant workers to change their employer after a set period, and to tighten regulations on foreign and national recruitment agencies by requiring them to meet human rights compliance standards to be licensed to operate in Taiwan. On women migrant workers, the committee recommends that the government prioritize the assessment process of the Domestic Workers Convention of the International Labour Organization in close consultation with national and migrant domestic workers, their unions and other advocates, and recommend this convention to the legislative yuan for domestication as a matter of urgency, and to develop a long-term care policy that addresses the needs for family care and the rights of local and migrant domestic workers. On distant water migrant fishers, the committee recommends that the government amend the Distant Waters Fisheries Act to provide for installation of Wi-Fi communication equipment on offshore vessels and set out the rights of fishers to regularly access those, and to investigate and analyze health and safety issues experienced on distant water vessels over the last 10 years as the basis for development of regulations and programs to reduce the hazardous nature work on those vessels. With respect to the right to justice, the committee recommends that the government ensure fair access to justice for all migrant workers, including those that are undocumented, to undertake a review of the Legal Aid Act and involve the National Human Rights Commission and migrant workers' advocates in the process, and to consider the establishment of a national legal interpretation service. The committee feels that non-national, undocumented children constitute possibly the most vulnerable group of any in Taiwan, and therefore it recommends that the government address the issue of regularizing the situation of the many undocumented women migrant workers, so they do not have to abandon their children to get them access to fundamental human rights, such as stable accommodation, education, and health services. And also to provide a child without any parents to care for them with immediate legal residency and citizenship. The committee is also concerned about discriminatory practices based on national origin in the marriage interview procedures and recommends that the government review this marriage interview system by introducing objective interview criteria that are not based on nationality or national origin. It also recommends that the government strengthen its efforts to prevent labor exploitation of foreign students. On refugees and asylum seekers, the committee recommends that the government expedite the process of adopting a refugee act without any further delay, and that is a recommendation that the expert group reviewing the two covenants has made already in all its three concluding observations since 2013. It should also closely review in this interim period before the adoption of the Refugee Act each case of possible deportation to prevent violations of the non-refoulement principle and ensure that the other rights are protected irrespective of the individual's legal status and nationality, provide legal aid to all asylum seekers, whether or not they cross the border legally, and abolish the criminalization of illegal entry of asylum seekers in the criminal code. And finally, the committee recommends that the National Human Rights Commission commit to developing within the next 2 years all the functions specified by the Paris Principles of the United Nations on national human rights institutions, including identifying through research and public consultations the most pressing human rights issues in Taiwan and developing plans to respond to each of these key priorities, developing an effective human rights, equality, and anti-discrimination complaints handling mechanism, and increasing public knowledge and awareness of human rights through a higher public profile. That's the short, or perhaps even too long, summary already of our main observations and recommendations. And as I said at the beginning, all four of us are happy to respond to any questions or comments that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor Novak. Just before we open for questions and comments, there's something that we have to do. And for that, can I invite Minister Low and Professor Novak to the front? Yes. Minister Low is going to receive the book of concluding observations from the International Review Committee. 接下来呢，我们有请我们的政委以及主席，我们在台上就可以了。On the stage, yes. 将代表台湾政府呢接受国际审查委员会所提出的结论性意见报告书。Okay, Professor Novak and Minister Luo, 请递交。请看向前方的镜头。Please look at the camera in front of you and let's have a photo together. 3, 2, 1. And also for the second photo, I would like to invite Ms. Noonan and also Professor Lightfoot and Professor Ko. Would you also please come to the front and join Minister Low and Professor Novak for another photo? 我们同时呢，也要邀请委员会的另外3位委员到舞台前方一起来合照哦。And please watch your steps. Be careful. Thank you. All right. Please look at the cameras in front of you. 3, 2, 1. 好，大家都有拍到吗？我们给台上的政委以及我们的委员一个掌声。Thank you so much. Your hard work is very much appreciated. And now you can take your seats once again on the stage. 接下来我们有请政委以及我们的委员呢在台上，我们再度就座。接下来呢，我们就准备开放给现场的记者以及我们团体的代表来。好，接下来呢，我们把时间交给政委。And now over to Minister Low.
Before we start the Q&A session, of course, we have Professor Novak to thank for summarizing the 48 main recommendations. And I wonder whether all the other committee members have anything to say. If you have anything to add, I would like to welcome the R.O.C members to add any remarks you like.
I would just like to add what a privilege it's been to serve on this independent review committee and what a great group the experts have been, and I have learned a lot from them, as I know you will as well. And I also just want to thank Minister Low, government agencies, the National Human Rights Commission and the civil society organisations, because this really is a model of what I wish we could see other countries doing. It really is something that deepens implementation of international human rights standards at the national level. So, and you all have a part to play in that. So you should all be very proud of what you've achieved already, but also know that you can do more. Thank you.
谢谢诺兰女士。
Thank you very much, Ms. Noonan, for your encouraging words and your acknowledgement. Professor Lightfoot.
I would like to echo the words of my colleague, Ms. Noonan, in expressing our appreciation to the ministers, to the government for undertaking this very positive review. I would also like to celebrate the care and the thoroughness with which every institution we have engaged with has approached this work. Government ministries, NGOs, civil society, National Human Rights Institution. Congratulations for your earnestness, your honestness, your thoroughness. We are all the better for it. I also want to acknowledge the significant progress to date in terms of Indigenous peoples' rights in Taiwan. What we have reviewed is already a very progressive legal framework and policy framework. And you can be very proud of this. There are also many ways, and I mentioned this at the hearing the other day, that we can all move forward to achieve full implementation of the rights of Indigenous peoples as indicated in international standards. So with that, I welcome Taiwan to join the rest of us on this very important and significant journey. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Lightfoot, for your acknowledgement and your encouragement. Among the 48 main recommendations, many of them refer to the promotion and the protection of the rights of the indigenous peoples. Professor Novak mentioned that ICERD will be better implemented with an implementing act. And other committee members also mentioned that in meeting international human rights standards, Taiwan can domesticate Convention 169 and 189. From the international experts' perspective, this is the expectations, and we consider them to be very valuable. And Professor Ko, would you like to say something too?
Thank you very much. Well, I would just like to join my colleagues for expressing our deepest gratitude for this opportunity. And we are so inspired by the efforts by the government. And also, it was really great opportunity for me to talk to the civil societies. And also, I really learned a lot from the discussion and the materials given by National Human Rights Commission. There are so many human rights problems in any countries, and some problems can take time to be solved. But I truly believe in eventually the efforts will make differences, and I am happy if this International Review Committee and as a member could play a role in Taiwan's effort to improve the situation. And I really, really like to thank everyone for this great opportunity. Thank you very much.
Once again, I would like to thank all four R.O.C members. We appreciate your concluding observations and recommendations after the international review process. On behalf of the government, I had received the copy of the concluding observations and recommendations. This is a responsibility and a commitment. We have a system to publish state reports. After the reports are published, these represent the start of the next round of work. So with these 48 recommendations, the government agencies will respond to them, and we will organize meetings that invite different agencies to discuss how division of labor among the government agencies and the NGOs can facilitate the implementation of the recommendations. And we will come up with written replies to the COR. And through the National Immigration Agency, we will share with you our documented responses and replies. But just like any other meetings, before governments come up with policies, we consult with civil society organizations to form consensus so that we have a clearer vision to promote the development, and so that we will get ready for the next round of the reports. Next Monday and Tuesday, we will have the midterm review for CEDAW. This is something unique with CEDAW. So the 4-year cycle is a bit too long. So replies, responses, and reactions to the recommendations have to be reviewed as to has progress being made, has challenges being encountered. So we're going to have the midterm review, and the local experts will help with the review, and we'll move on to the 5th round of international review for CEDAW Convention. And I think when we make developments in human rights, we make inches of development. It's hard to make striding developments. For example, the Judicial Yuan's 78 interpretation help us to legalize same-sex marriage. It's a breakthrough, but human rights cannot rely on breakthrough. Mainstreaming of human rights have to be implemented in our daily lives and in all the detailed work done by government agencies so that we can have a good foundation of human rights, so that human rights is not only a slogan, but actual work implemented in our lives. And let's work together. Okay, so we promise and we commit ourselves to fulfill our obligations. And my call to the government agencies is that we have received these copy of concluding recommendations, and moving on, we'll need to work together. Since this is a press conference, we would like to open the floor for questions and answers. May I make some announcement here? This is a press conference, so I will invite the press to ask questions first. Second, after press asks questions, NGOs can ask questions if you have. Thirdly, after the NGO's questions, we will invite Department of Human Rights or other government agencies or NRCs to ask questions. If you, commissioners from NRC, if you have questions, feel free to raise that. And then in the end, government agencies can respond if we still have time. Okay, let's invite questions from the press. Anyone from press would like to ask questions?
请工作同仁给麦克风。
Please identify yourself, your affiliation. Thank you. I speak for the Central News Agency. In future, the indigenous peoples, migrant workers, and their access to justice, as well as the establishment of a nationwide interpretation institution. So is this possible? What is the current progress? How do you plan to implement these recommendations? In principle, I will collect 3 questions before we answer them. Any other questions from the press? If no, we will answer the question first. In terms of interpretation service, there has been some interagency collaboration, either in the form of projects or programs. In this national report, we also propose to have more comprehensive approach to this. Maybe I can ask the MIA to answer the question about the promotion of judicial interpretation services. Ms. Huang, please. On interpretation service, the Executive Yuan has asked us to come up with a pilot project which will last 2 years, starting from April 1st this year. And in terms of the mechanism, the pay level, the languages covered, we plan to make more improvements. Some legislators also mentioned that these efforts are not yet enough. So on April 9th this year, Minister Ling also had a meeting with us, asking us to provide more training for interpreters, more detailed classification of languages covered. So there will be further improvement to the training programs for interpreters. So in the 2-year pilot project, we will make every effort possible. In addition, the Ministry of Labor, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Health and Welfare will also take part in the implementation of the pilot project. In 2 years, we will come back and review the outcomes to see what else we can do to better the program. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Huang. Interpretation system, we know that we have suffered from shortage of resources. The government has made some progress in investing resources in this area. However, there's still an imbalance between supply and demand. Interpretation service can be very specialized. For example, judicial interpretation, medical interpretation, how we can train more qualified interpreters to meet the need. Whether or not we can set up a national interpretation service institution to provide such services, or do we stick to the current situation where there are separate programs in different agencies? These are important issues for us. Of course, we know that technology keeps advancing. Maybe we can leverage technology to make up for the shortage of interpreters. I'm sure in the wake of the concluding observations and recommendations, we will build on the foundation we have set to better the interpretation performance services we can provide. Any other questions? If no, then we will open the floor to receive questions from civic society organizations. Mr. Huang from Covenant Watch. Well, I think we do value and cherish the international review meetings. I hope that in the wake of the review meetings, we can stay in touch with the independent reviewers. In fact, whenever we discuss the recommendations and concluding observations, I think we need to have more detailed information as to how we can implement these recommendations. So we still need more guidance from the reviewers. So I would advise all government agencies to stay in touch with the independent reviewers. As NGOs, we also like to stay in touch with these independent reviewers to receive guidance from you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Huang from Covenant Watch. Well, I think there are many things we have to do aside from implementing the recommendations. We will keep the reviewers posted of the progress we will make. I think Mr. Huang says that we need to be even more proactive to benefit from the expertise of the independent reviewers. We know that all the reviewers are experts in this field. If they are willing to continue to provide us their expertise and insights, of course, we would like to hear from them. Professor Novak, would you like to let us know if that is possible?
Yes, I think that was the same practice we have had in the different review committees on reviewing the two covenants, that in the meantime, in between the different cycles, that we are in contact and are available also, both for the government also and to civil society for any kind of questions or also comments that you might have. Thank you.
I would like to thank Covenants Watch for that question. It's an important one. And I would like to indicate that I am always available and always interested to engage in conversations about concrete measures to implement Indigenous peoples' rights. Personally, it's my focus of academic interest, but it's also the focus of the UN expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples. We specifically look at practical implementation measures. And there is an entire body now. The body has existed since 2007, and there's quite a network of international experts in implementing Indigenous peoples' rights between the current members and the former members, coming from all 7 regions of the world. And they are all committed and all devoted in their personal capacities to joining any sort of consultation, conversation, visit to Taiwan. And we could pull together an international body of experts specifically on that issue quite easily. And we would, my colleagues and I in those circles would welcome that very much.
好，谢谢。我们是给
Shall we give a round of applause to our independent experts? Any other questions from the NGOs? EB, thank you. Thank you so much for coming all the way to Taiwan to perform this review meeting. I think we have had a very successful meeting. I would like to follow up on what Mr. Huang said. In fact, after the establishment of the Department of Human Rights and the NHRC, we have been advocating for institutionalization, that is within the NHRC or in the Department of Human Rights. There should be a think tank consisting of international experts. So we should invite the current or former members of the IRC to join this think tank so that even after the review meetings or before the review meeting takes place, they can serve as our advisors. In this case, we will have a ready access to their expertise. We don't need to speculate what the experts mean in their recommendations. Whenever we have questions or doubts, we can have ready access to seek these experts' opinions. And aside from the regular review meetings, I think for some more thorny systematic issues, we can have a special repertoire mechanism. For example, for migrant fishers or the indigenous people's right to land. And these are all very thorny issues we have to address. So maybe we can ask 1 or 2 members of the IRC to come to Taiwan to help us to perform very specific site visits regarding those issues. The second point I want to make is, I think if Taiwanese government takes seriously these recommendations, then even if we cannot implement all these recommendations within a very short span of time, then at least the government must stop holding on to stances which contravene with these recommendations. For example, just a week ago, the Constitutional Court in Taiwan had a debate about the abolishment of death penalty. However, I think you may recall the recommendations made by former IRCs a few years ago. None of the recommendations were referred to in the debate. And we know that in 2 weeks, we are going to have the interim review of the CEDAW report. However, in the government's review committee, in our incoming cabinet, only 8 are female ministers. So I think it's less than 50% of the cabinet composition. I think we have not done enough to follow the spirit of the CEDAW Convention. So I would like to urge the government to do better in this area, to make Taiwan a better country. Thank you. Thank you, EB. Thank you for your reminders. I think the IRC members would feel quite strongly about the examples you just gave. I know there are some thorny systematic issues which exist in Taiwan for a long time. When we promote human rights, we have encountered obstacles, and we know it has to do with the fact that it's difficult to forge consensus across sectors of our society. However, these obstacles must be addressed jointly by all of us. We have been emphasizing that Taiwan is a democracy with the separation of powers across different branches of government. We respect judicial independence. So the Constitutional Court is empowered to review laws which may violate the constitutions. We respect the mechanism and the operation of the Constitutional Court and their interpretation rulings. And I think that's a very important principle, the rule of law in a democracy. We cannot use the so-called majority's opinion to override independent judiciary. I think we have to respect the separation of powers.
But thank you very much for your reminder. And the other 2 points are great suggestions. Yes, we can have a database or a think tank of international experts. It's not that we don't have it. We have it, but such a list or databases are maintained by different government agencies because they are in charge of different review processes for different conventions. And for each review, there are various international experts with different backgrounds, but there is always commonality among different human rights. So I believe that many of these experts are linked. So we do need a network so that international human rights experts can see us in Taiwan, and we are able to access their support. So this is a great recommendation. I think Department of Human Rights and Transitional Justice is also here. This is a great recommendation to follow. Since we have 12 state reports, and we should compile a list or database of all the international experts that we have invited for such reviews. But to have a list is one thing. I think to use it or to take advantage of it is more important. Some experts are not available, but except for those cases, I think they are willing to support. I think people who are in the human rights circles share one thing. They have passion for human rights. If it is related to human rights, they're always willing to do more. So Department of Human Rights can follow up with this recommendation, okay? Since Taiwan is not a member of the UN, currently we do not have human rights special rapporteur that can be sent to other countries. And what you said may be a different mode. It's worth it to have some discussions with the NHRC. Maybe it is possible to develop a new mode which will lead to in-depth investigation reports. And that wouldn't be only a one-week meeting, but a long-term investigation process to review the human rights issues in Taiwan and to identify the root causes of those issues. Over there, please hold on a second. I think we have two R.O.C members who would like to make remarks. Professor Novak first, and then Ms. Noonan.
No, thank you very much for your comments. And having read very carefully the statement of the Minister of Justice to the Constitutional Court on the death penalty on Tuesday, I should say that I was a little surprised that there was no reference whatsoever to the various recommendations that have been made by the review committee in relation to the two covenants. Even if you don't agree, but I think it might be a question of courtesy and procedure to also make this reference to our recommendations. Thank you.
Short points. The first one is, first of all, to acknowledge the expertise which there is within the civil society organisation and the advocacy groups that exist here in Taiwan. Many of them have an expertise at a very high professional level. And I think you will see throughout our report, which I don't think's happened in the previous reports, that we specifically refer or suggest to the government that in developing legislation, policy and practices, they should involve not just scholars and so-called experts, but the advocacy groups that have the expertise and have worked for a long time on those issues here within Taiwan, and representatives of chosen by Indigenous peoples through their own processes. And I would just like to emphasise that. I think that's a critical element in the development of successful human rights integrated legislation, policy and practices. And the other thing is, and actually the Minister really took the words out of my mouth, was to say that I think there is a really important role for the National Human Rights Commission in grappling with some of these complex issues, because they are complex. And actually it is difficult for governments. I don't think we should underestimate the pressures that are on a government, not just in Taiwan, but governments everywhere, but it is here also for some other reasons. And they are usually, human rights issues usually cover more than one departmental area. And government is necessarily quite siloed. And we know there are intersectional issues between, affecting individuals or groups who may be disadvantaged or marginalised or subject to human rights violations. And so I think, and I know that the National Human Rights Commission is a young institution, but I do think it's time for it, it can't do it with everything, but to identify 2 or 3 of these complex issues that are reflected in our report in consultation with CSOs and government agencies, and use, for example, the mechanism of national public inquiries, which bring together research, contributions from government agencies about what's actually happening, from the lived experience of people who are affected, but also do it in a way with public hearings, but also confidential hearings that raise the profile of the issues and help to build consensus and understanding about them. And I think that's a critical role that the National Human Rights Commission has, to help to build understanding between the different peoples and groups that live in Taiwan. And that's one of the ways in which a national human rights institution is required by the Paris Principles to provide advice and guidance to the legislative yuan, to the executive yuan. It's not just there to receive complaints, and criticise the government, but also to find ways of dealing with some of these complex issues. And I was very pleased to hear the Minister say much the same. So I think it's something to be developed over the next period with the National Human Rights Commission. And certainly I know I and others are very willing to provide whatever personal support could assist.
好，谢谢诺兰委员。好，有两。
Thank you very much, Ms. Noonan. I think there are two NGO representatives over there first, and then over here. First of all, I would like to thank all your efforts on behalf of Taiwan's Religions Association. I would like to make the following remarks. Religious human rights are usually less visible. They are not materialized, and they are not related to probably many people. Many migrant workers believe in minority religions. Their religions are neglected, even though such negligence is not very visible. However, such negligence has great damage to their lives, to their beliefs. Second, our government always claims that there is diversity or integrated system for religions. But religious harmony means that all different religions can get along, but religious rights are the rights between the religions and the government. But governments tend to say that, we have all kinds of religious activities, and therefore there is religious harmony in Taiwan. I think that's a misunderstanding. Second, MOE mentions that there is regular teachings about religions, but I think the legal concept to protect religious freedoms or religious human rights is still missing. Because in Taiwan, it seems that the governance is based on the emperor-led governance instead of the God-led governance concept in Europe. And I would like to give you an example. 2 months ago, there was a social incident involving a child, and the media says that the child was involved with temple activities, and the involved is an implication of negative involvement, and the temple didn't realize that that kind of comment is an insult to religion. So the idea to protect religions in Taiwan is still lacking. So I urge government of Taiwan and international scholars to give a legal basis of religious human rights. With such a legal basis, then we can protect indigenous peoples, migrant workers, and religious people in Taiwan, so that we can provide better religious freedom protection. Thank you. Thank you for your recommendation. Let me summarize what you said. You believe that there is religious freedom, but there is no protection of religious human rights, right? Because in Taiwan, people respect each other's right to believe, but it doesn't mean that religious human rights are fully protected. Do I understand you correctly? Okay. In this regard, we need to work together more. Indeed, in some individual cases, things could have been done better. Recently, especially the NHRC had pointed out that some undocumented migrant workers go to church on Sunday or go to some religious sites, and the police would stake around those sites in order to capture the undocumented migrant workers. I think this is a poor practice. Rights, and they have the religious freedom, but their religious human rights are not fully protected. I think this case brings out what you described. Yes, in this area, there is great room for improvement. Thank you for coming to meetings like this one for many times and for giving us recommendations. Over there.
My name is Jasmine I'm a union director of Domestic Caretaker Union in Taoyuan City. And I want to say that I agree with, to the man in front of me that about religious human right, because I'm a Filipino, but my heart goes to all Indonesian migrant domestic caregiver who cannot go out to worship, to have a fellowship, because their fellowship is during Friday. So before my question, I'm not able to attend to April 23rd because we are trying to register, but the immigration said our registration cannot go through. So I'm trying to say is this is one of the many difficulties that we are facing in Taiwan, whether it be website, public offices, we cannot, they don't provide bilingual. Even there is English translation to any website, there is a complication to follow to all their announcement and to all their guidelines. So my question is about the recommendation and suggestion about the article in Employment Service Act for freedom to transfer. I want to know how is it possible that the revision of this article can make it happen if is the government will be willing to consult us or to be part of the revision of this act? Because as I remember, there are several meetings that we demand for the MOL, especially in 2018 when we demand to have a face-to-face meeting, to have a mandatory day off, because our day off is just written in our labor contract, but it's not legislated in Taiwan. So for the whole week, we negotiate for them that we want them to face us during Sunday because we can assert our right to have a day off during Sunday only. But their answer is their day off is only Sunday. So how can this happen to the recommendation of revision of the article in Employment Service Act about the restriction to have a freedom to transfer for migrant workers? Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine. About the freedom to change employers, I think we hear the recommendations from the IRC. I will ask the MOL to respond to your question first. And I would like to apologize to you that if your organization was unable to register or sign up for the review meeting, my apologies. Basically, you can join the meeting online or on-site, and there are limited seats available for on-site participants. Usually, those seats would first be reserved for organizations which have provided parallel responses. So as you said, when it comes to digital divide, we did not provide sufficient services and information for your members. As a result, your organization was unable to join the on-site review meeting. I'm sorry. The NIA, actually, I would like to remind the colleagues from the NIA that your announcements have not been provided in a multilingual manner. It is a pity. Make sure you provide information in multiple languages so that they can reach the target audience. So I think it's just like the interpretation service. There's still room for improvement. I think the Department of Human Rights should also make sure that when we provide information, we have to provide multilingual versions, especially if the announcements impact the rights of migrant workers or fishers. We have to provide such information in the language they are familiar with. So my apologies to you. As for the freedom of changing employers, anyone from the MOL, please. So in response to Jasmine's question, in the concluding observations, it's also recommended that maybe after a certain period of time, the migrant workers can change employers. In fact, we have already amended the law. After 3 years of employment, the migrant workers can freely change employers. However, we know that for certain families with people with disabilities, the need for long-term care is very significant, and we don't yet have a clear decision on the procedures for changing employers, but we have been streamlining the procedures for changing employers in response. Well, I think more discussion is needed to address this issue. Many migrant worker organizations are very concerned about this issue. May I also remind you that Jasmine also mentioned that they cannot take a day off during the weekdays. So maybe you can take into consideration their situation to see when would be a good time to meet them in person, to have a meeting. So recently, we have some reports about the intermediation meetings to solve industrial disputes. And such meetings can take place in the evening, and I think that's very good. That is why that particular intermediation department's satisfaction rate from their clients is as high as 70–80%. I think that is great. We should try our best to accommodate the migrant workers' needs. Professor Noonan?
Thank you. And I just want to make clear that we do acknowledge in the concluding observations that progress has been made to allow some migrant workers an opportunity to transfer positions, transfer jobs, as you say, after 3 years. But what we heard in the public hearings and the written submissions was that there are significant barriers to that process. So actually, they're not as straightforward as they appear, in writing, as it were. And I think the Minister has rightly said there are areas, has himself noted the ongoing concern of migrant workers' advocacy groups and migrant workers themselves. But I'd also like to take this opportunity to congratulate the Domestic Workers Union on its establishment and on its efforts to provide unionisation for domestic workers. I want to acknowledge how extremely difficult that is everywhere to provide effective union voice for people working in private households or in very small businesses. So I want to acknowledge what a hard job it is. And you've highlighted just some practical impediments. And I certainly don't think that, given the long hours that domestic workers are often required to work, that they should have to, well, not that there was any agreement, but that they should have to then have meetings on their day off. I think the state does have to recognise the union and the representatives of domestic workers and provide for them to be able to engage in meetings, negotiations with local government and as necessary, the main government agencies, and make that clear that that is part of their entitlements. So I just want to thank you for the work you're doing for domestic workers and acknowledge how hard it is.
好，谢谢在提醒我时间。
Thank you. I think we are running out of time. Maybe we can entertain some final questions. Maybe anyone from the NHRC? Questions from government agencies? Commissioner Wang, please. Please wait for the microphone. Distinguished members of the IRC, I would like to thank you for your time and efforts during the past week in coming up with these concluding observations and recommendations, in which you cited many opinions from the NHRC's independent opinion report, as well as the parallel responses from the NGOs. Thank you. Also, we appreciate that you have laid out your expectations for our commission. That is, in the next 2 years, you expect us to do more. I think we will continue with our efforts. We have interim work plans. And some of the items you mentioned may not be able to be implemented within the next 2 years, but we will prioritize some items. For example, the complaints mechanism regarding discrimination. We actually visited Australia. We learned that there are diverse complaints mechanisms. They also have mediators who have undergone comprehensive training. So aside from national inquiry and judicial remedies, there are different ways we can do more to promote human rights. We will continue to discuss with Minister Low in this area. Yes, our commission is a young institution, but we have experienced the review of CRC, CRPD, CEDAW, as well as ICERD. So we have provided independent opinions on those occasions. In fact, we are in the position to monitor the actions taken by the government to implement these conventions. This afternoon, we will have an opportunity to interact with the IRC members. We look forward to learning from you. Thank you. Commissioner Kadiso, I would like to respond to Professor Noonan's comments on indigenous peoples. I think there are 2 points I would like to make. One, international perspective. The other is domestic perspective. We know that there's an Indian movement in the 1970s in the U.S., And also, in the 1989, there's a convention in the rights of the indigenous people's rights. And in 2007, there is the UN DRIP. And in Taiwan, we, in 1994, finally have given the appropriate name to the indigenous peoples in Taiwan. So what I'm trying to say is the CIP referred to the IPBL, which is aligned with 90% of the UN DRIP. But I think there are still implementation gaps. I think in New Zealand, there are the Maoris people. And I think okay, and then think we share the Austronesian language with the Maori people. Thank you, Commissioner Katiso. Even though the NHRC is only 4-year-old, but it has taken part in the international review of 5 international human rights conventions. And of course, the Constitutional Court in Taiwan has also invited the NHRC members to provide their experts' reports. And of course, on 23rd of April, the Constitutional Court had a debate on the legality of death penalty, and the NHRC indeed provided a report on the illegality of the death penalty. I believe the NHRC stands firm on its promotion and protection of human rights as an independent institution. I believe all the recommendations we hear from the IRC aim to help the NHRC to perform even better going forward. I think we have used up all the time for the press conference. Please give another round of applause for the IRC members. Thank you.
记者会呢就到这边告一段落，再次谢谢各位贵宾、各位团体代表的参与哦，谢谢。那如果有借口译设备的贵宾呢，请您记得将口译设备归还给我们的工作人员，谢谢。Ladies and gentlemen, with that, we end the press conference today. Thank you once again to all the members of the International Review Committee, and thank you all for your participation. Thank you. 那各位贵宾，我们场外呢备有餐盒。各位贵宾呢离场的时候，都记得拿一个